Hello and welcome to the first part of the Basal Breakdown. So, I decided to start this series because I am seeing a real need right now for talking about ways that we can make our basal, our core curriculum, more applicable for the needs of us and our students. There's a lot of districts right now that are being required to choose a core curriculum off of a list. I live in Virginia, and in Virginia this year, the VLA, the Virginia Literacy Act, went into effect, and it required all districts to choose a curriculum from an approved list. And I know that for many teachers, this is the first time you've ever had to use a curriculum. And it can be really frustrating when for years you have been having to cobble together your own curriculum and you've done a really good job of it just to be turn around and say, oh, nope, actually, you have to do this. So, what I wanted to do with this series is I wanted to create a series of videos that gave you really practical, small tweaks that you can do to your core program to improve student outcomes. I know that so many of us are having to teach, quote unquote, with fidelity. But I loved what Pam Kastner said at the Reading League last year. She said the only fidelity we should have is to the evidence, right? The only fidelity we should have is to the research and the evidence about what we know about how kiddos learn to read. Now, I know you know that, and I know that, but not necessarily the people making these decisions know that. So we have to work within the constraints of what we have been given, right? That's what we're going to do. I'm going to create these videos, 10, 15-minute videos where you can work within the constraints that have been given to you by your core reading program. So, one thing that I want to say before I get started, today we're going to talk about two tips for improving comprehension. But before we get into those two comprehension tips, I want to say this to you. The knowledge that you have is the one thing that they can never take from you. Legislation can and will change. Your administrators will change. Central office will change. The basal that they give you can change. But if you are prepared with the knowledge about how kiddos learn to read, that can never be taken from you. And no matter how scripted a program is, you need to have the knowledge about what to put in, what to take out. Why? Because so many of these curriculum have been bloated in order to pass these assessments in order to be approved on a list. So, for example, and I'm not going to name specific programs, you might have a program that would deliver both balanced literacy materials, such as guided reading levels for kindergarten, but then they also say that they are structured literacy and they provide decodables. So it is only when we have the knowledge that we are able to weave through the overabundance of things that they send us to figure out what is most important for our kiddos. Now, let's go into two really practical tips that you can take into account so that you can make a better impact for your students. The first one is we have got to actively build background knowledge. Unfortunately, what I see a lot of times in these textbooks is that instead of building background knowledge, there's like an activate background knowledge section. And I have to tell you this, we simply cannot activate background knowledge if we have never built it in the first place. If children do not have background knowledge about a topic, their comprehension will suffer. Why? Well, when we're reading, it's all about making a mental model of what the author is giving us, right? So when we're reading, we're trying to create this image of what's going on. How much more difficult is that going to be if you don't even have the background knowledge to understand what is going on? Say you're reading something about an Arctic trip up to, or a trip to the North Pole, right? If you aren't familiar with hiking, I'm not even familiar with what they do. Think how much more difficult it is going to be for your kiddos to understand what is happening because they don't have the background knowledge of what is going on. There's a really famous study called the baseball study, and basically what they found is that children who were lower leveled readers but had a high knowledge of baseball were able to compensate for their reading level because of their background knowledge. So if you have background knowledge, Sharon Vaughn said on the Reading League podcast, she said, with enough background knowledge, comprehension comes free. And I love that quote. With enough background knowledge, comprehension comes free. Tim Shanahan says, studies have shown that prior knowledge influences comprehension in many ways. Most obviously, it reduces the learning load. The more you already know about what an author is telling you, the less new information that you have to learn. When we are reading a text, we only have so much cognitive ability, right? I always talk about a cognitive desk space. Your desk is only so big. And if you are spending all of your time, say we're learning about the rainforest, and you're trying to spend all of your time just trying to understand what a daggone Amazon rainforest is, you aren't going to have the ability, you're not going to have the desk space left to understand the message that the author is trying to give you. So instead of just activating background knowledge, we're going to work to actively build it. Whatever topic is happening within your text, you can use one of these methods to help build background knowledge instead of just activating it. The first one is a video. This is actually the second time I filmed this video because the first time the music was playing over me talking the entire time. But a video is a great way to help kiddos get that initial mental model. Say you live in an urban community where children don't really know about gardening and planting, but you have to teach your plant unit. How much more information would they be able to bring with them to the text if they had seen something like a time-lapse video of plants growing? Right? You're already helping to create that mental model. You're priming that brain for the information that is going to come. Another idea, and don't use all of these ideas in one day. Pick something, pick a way to build background knowledge. Another one is with photographs and illustrations. So going back to the plant one, maybe you display a poster of a plant and you ask them, what do you notice? And be like, oh, well, why do you think there's rocks down here? What are all these squiggly things coming down? And just talking about the different parts of a plant. To give you some different examples of photographs and illustrations, say you have a text or a theme, a topic like the Civil War. Maybe you could bring in photographs of what the camps looked like, discuss what life was like living inside of an army camp during the Civil War. If you're learning about the solar system, you could bring in pictures, those incredible pictures from the James Webb Telescope. Even something like economics. Say you brought in different charts of like the inflation, the price increasing. There are so many ways that we can help build their understanding of a topic before we have to go into the text. We have got to stop taking the maps and globes out of our classrooms. Our kiddos really struggle having an understanding, like geographically, of where things are. So the more that we can incorporate that into our instruction, honestly, the better. I love looking at the back of the seed packets. That's what this is. If I were teaching a unit about plants, I could easily pull out one of these because now you have an authentic, a meaningful way to reference a map. Because if you don't understand what's happening in this map, well, then you're not going to know when you can plant your flowers. Another way that we can actively build background knowledge is with physical artifacts. For the plant theme, we could just bring in seeds, right? Like that'd be a great way. Watch them grow from seeds to plants. But say going back to the Civil War, maybe you bring in uniform replicas. You could bring in like replicas of hats or jackets. You could bring in like copies of letters or diaries or photographs. You could bring in maps or battle plans. There are so many different artifacts that you could put into your kiddos' hands. Another example, maybe for economics, you bring in money from around the world and have kiddos look at it. There are so many different things that we could bring in to help create that mental model for our kiddos. And before I move on from talking about actively building background knowledge, I want to just end this section with a quote from Natalie Wexler in The Knowledge Gap. She says, as for comprehension, the most important factor in determining whether readers can understand a text is how much relevant vocabulary or background knowledge they have. So y'all, once the coding is out of the way, it's background knowledge, it's vocabulary. We have got to actively work to build both of those things because that's going to make an impact on how well our kiddos understand a text, which is what it's all about in the first place. The second tip that we're going to talk about today is creating text sets. I know that you have a curriculum, and I know that you have to use the books that are within that curriculum. But I want you to ask yourself, is it enough? We know that the single largest contributing factor to vocabulary once kiddos can read is actually wide reading. So does your curriculum allow for enough wide reading of text? A lot of the textbooks that I see really only have one or two texts for a week, and that's just simply not enough, I feel. So let's think about ways that we can look at the text that your textbook is giving you, because they all have these modules, they all have these themes to start, and think about ways that we can bring in additional text to build vocabulary and background knowledge about the topic. This is not what I mean. These are all lovely books, fantastic books, but I want you to think, what do The Recess Queen, Spoon, A Bike Like Sergio, Bee Dance, this bridge book, Who Has These Feet? There's no real connecting theme. If I read all of those, we might be able to find out the main idea, but we're not going to build our understanding of the world, right? But say, going back to the plants, we start incorporating more plant text, right? We go to ReadWorks, and maybe in our small groups, if you don't have the Freedom and Whole group, take this to small group. And maybe in your small groups, you begin by pulling something from ReadWorks. Shameless plug for ReadWorks. I love it. It's free. You can search by topic, skill, English, Spanish, paired text. One of the best websites ever created for teachers is ReadWorks. But say you start by just talking about what plants need, and then you go into talking about different kinds of plants. Then you can bring in additional text sets. And these texts are way different from here because these don't have a connecting thread, despite how wonderful they are. I'm not telling you not to read them, they're fantastic books. But these all have a connecting thread because these are going to have the same vocabulary, they're going to have the same understandings, and knowledge is sticky. Once you know about a topic, when you go to another text, it's going to stick to it. So I want you to think, say you go and you read a text and it's talking about how plants can eat bugs, right? Well, if you don't know that it's weird that plants are eating bugs, it's going to be harder to understand that. If you don't understand that plants use photosynthesis to make their own food and that these plants struggle for photosynthesis, it's going to be harder to understand. But if you do understand that, you don't have to spend your cognitive desk space thinking about those other things. You can spend that desk space thinking about what the author is trying to teach you in this book. When we create text sets around a topic, we are helping our kiddos to live within this world, to build their background knowledge, to build their vocabulary, and that is where we are going to see the biggest bang for our buck for improving comprehension. So those are my 2 tips for today. Next week, I want you to come back because we are going to talk about teaching pronoun references and we are going to talk about writing about reading. But for today, remember, we discussed creating text sets around topics and themes and actively building that background knowledge. I would love if you could give this a like and a subscribe. And if you want to contact me, you can find me at Savannah@CampbellCreatesReaders.com. I have a website where I talk all things science of reading. You can find me on Instagram, and I have a podcast called Creating Readers with Savannah Campbell. Thank you so much for listening in for the first part of the Basal Breakdown, and I'm going to see you next week with 2 more tips for strengthening comprehension.